Welcome to The Rest of the Moose,
Where's the rest of this moose?
a podcast about anything and everything.
You must have hated this moose.
Here's your host, Chris Crum.
One of the questions that I get asked a lot, especially in my real job of being a travel advisor and travel agency owner, is what is the best vacation you ever went on? Or most of the time, since I do a lot of cruises, what's your favorite cruise that you've ever done? And it makes me think back to my radio days and a question that the artists always hated, and so we tried to never ask it. But you would hear a lot of other radio stations and radio personalities ask Brad Paisley, for example, somebody I remember interviewing very well because he was just so funny and so wonderful. And, you know, he does 50 interviews in one day for a new album. And so we're number 49 on the list. And Brad's going, God, I'm ready to be done with this, because the first 48 all ask the same questions. Tell me about the album. What's your favorite song on the album? And so on and so forth. And so it got to the point where you tried to come up with anything other than those questions just because you didn't want to bore the poor guy. And you knew that all day long, that's all he'd been doing. But invariably, if you asked a music artist or a composer or Billy Joel, who's one of my all-time favorite performers, what's your favorite song you ever wrote, or what's the best song you ever sang? They will 9 times out of 10 say, well, those are like my children, and I really can't pick a favorite. They might give you a top 5 or a top 10, but, you know, it could change on any given day. And I know, knowing Billy Joel like I do, Billy will tell you on any given day that this song he loves and this song he hates. And then, you know, he might change his mind on it and go, you know, I don't mind performing that one anymore. There was a time when he wouldn't do Uptown Girl or The Longest Time in concert. And there were times where he doesn't want to do this particular song. So it comes and goes. But my point is, it's hard for me to pinpoint a specific cruise or vacation that was a favorite. And so what I thought I might do as kind of an ongoing feature on this particular podcast that 5 or 6 people listen to, including me 3 times, is to highlight a few of my favorite trips. And that way we can talk about the different ones that I've enjoyed, and I can give you an idea what you might expect should you decide to go on any of these. And by the way, you can book them through Premier Custom Travel at premiercustomtravel.com. But anyway, I digress. So to pick the one to start off with was kind of difficult because, again, you know, I don't have a specific favorite. I have a bunch that I've enjoyed. But I'm going to talk about one in particular that I think if you are a cruise aficionado, this should be on your list at some point. And that is the Panama Canal. And I have sailed it one time. I'm signed up to do it again next Christmas. And I would love to do it multiple times. And I'll get into why. And you'll probably understand why as I talk a bit about this particular cruise. Now, the one that I did was on Disney Cruise Line. And I did it back in, I believe it was 2017. Cruises like that are usually what are called repositioning cruises. And what that means is that the ship is not going round trip, because it's hard to do that for the Panama Canal. And in fact, I can't think of a full transit of the canal that is a round trip cruise. That would be pretty challenging unless it's a world cruise. But basically what it is when the ships move from one region to another. So, for example, in this particular case, the ship was spending the summer in Alaska, and when its season in Alaska was done, it was going to head here to Texas. And so on October 27th of 2017, the Disney Wonder left San Diego after it had sailed down to there from Alaska, and it wound up in Galveston 14 nights later. The great thing about that is it was a full Panama Canal transit. Now, when you sail the Panama Canal, you have 2 ways that you can do it. One of them is what's called a partial transit, and that is where your ship goes in. Let's say you do it out of Galveston round trip. You would sail down to the Panama Canal, sail in through the locks into Lake Gatun, and then you turn around and come back out in the same day. So you see one side of the canal. You do not sail all the way through. If you do a full transit, then you see both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. You see 6 different locks, and you do the entire experience, which is what we got to do on Disney Cruise Line. So let me give you a recap of that cruise and kind of talk about what made the Panama Canal so special to see. because it is an absolute engineering marvel. And it's one of those things that, like I said, if you're a regular cruiser, you definitely want to, at some point, experience the Panama Canal and all that it has to offer. So let me kind of walk you through a day by day and then kind of give you the highlights of what made it so special. Now, one of the great pieces of advice that I got before I sailed through the Panama Canal was to read a book called The Path Between the Seas by David McCullough. And David McCullough is one of those authors. He wrote 1776, The Bio of John Adams, and a bunch of other fantastic historical pieces of literature. The Path Between the Seas is his chronicling of the building of the Panama Canal. And it is quite a book. And David is nothing if not detailed. And I will tell you that this book dives deep into the details to the point where you might consider an audiobook because it's a little bit easier to digest. But it is a fascinating account of something that probably should have never gotten made because, quite frankly, there were too many governments involved. The French tried and gave up. The U.S. almost gave up. There were several times where the local Indians on the Isthmus of Panama were tired of the people trying to figure it out, and they were leading them around in circles just to try to make them go away. But ultimately, it did get built, and it is a remarkable feat of engineering. So we left on the 27th out of San Diego on the Disney Wonder, headed for Galveston. And we had a sea day, and then we did the Mexican Riviera, which is Cabo San Lucas, Puerto Vallarta. So we had a couple of port days there. And then it was a stretch of 4 days in a row at sea because you're going all the way down virtually to the equator to get to the Panama Canal. It is not much further to get down to the equator. You're going a long way. So we had 4 days at sea. Now, what those sea days did is they afforded us an opportunity to learn about the Panama Canal. And Disney did something that was wonderful. They brought on board a Panama Canal expert. And not only that, he was somebody who had been in the Navy and the Army, interestingly enough, but also had been a Panama Canal pilot. And he came on board and did lectures every single day during that particular sailing. And his name was Captain Ken Puckett. And like I said, he had been a Panama Canal pilot, been in the Army and the Navy, and he was absolutely fascinating. So every single sea day, Ken would do a 1-hour lecture in the Walt Disney Theater about a different topic. So the first sea day, it was an introduction to the Panama Canal. And another sea day, it was, the operational day-to-day of the Panama Canal. One day he talked about the cost of going through the Panama Canal, which was fascinating because there's two ways that you can go through the Panama Canal. You can pay, or you can pay to go through when you want to. Now, your ships are charged by a couple of different metrics. The passenger ships are charged by berth. And it's interesting because they're actually charged whether or not there's somebody in the bed or not. So, for example, I sailed solo, and my room held 4 people. So I paid, Disney, I should say, paid, and I paid through my fare, a higher cost for me, and then we paid a lower price for the empty beds. But ultimately, it wound up being a certain number. And if I remember correctly, the number was around $400,000 is what it was going to cost us to go through the Panama Canal. And that was accounting for all the berths and the fees and everything. Then if we wanted to choose the time we wanted to go through, which, by the way, you have to as a cruise ship, it's an additional 10% surplus, so another $40,000. And when you get to the Panama Canal and you're on the Pacific or Atlantic side, or when you're inside the canal in the lake there are dozens of ships sitting there waiting for their turn, some of which had paid the premium to get to go through at a certain time, and other ones where they said, no, we're not really in a rush, and so we'll get there when we get there. And so when you think about it, if you're transporting timely cargo, so for example, food that might be perishable or something that needs to get somewhere urgently, then it may be worthwhile to pay that extra bonus and go through. And then the other ships just sit there and wait their turn and hope for their name to get called, and you don't know when it's going to be. And then you also have the added complication of there are 2 sets of locks. There are the original locks that were built back when the canal was built 100 plus years ago. And there are 2 lanes there. And then you have the new locks, and there's only 1 set. So when you have 2 sets of old locks, you can pretty much, if you want to, have traffic going 2 directions, because 1 set of ships can be going in or out of that particular lock into the lake or out of the lake, wherever, depending on what side of the canal you're on. And then you can have traffic going the other direction. And what you have to understand, for those of you that don't understand how locks work, the ship sails in, the doors close, and then they either flood the chamber or drain the chamber to make the ship rise or lower to be able to meet the higher elevation of the lake or the lower elevation, depending on which direction you're going. But that's what locks do, is they basically raise and lower the ships. And there's 3 sets of locks at each side of the canal. So you're going up 3 steps or down 3 steps, depending on where you're going. Now, the new locks only have 1 direction, which means you can only do 1 ship at a time. So when the Disney Wonder goes through, we have to do all 3 locks before they can let another ship come in, unless the ship behind us happens to be going the same direction. So if you have a ship go through, let's just say northbound, going from, and it goes north-south, by the way, more than it does east-west. So let's just say a ship's going from the Pacific into the lake, and we go in and we're in the middle lock. You can't send a ship the other direction until we're completely out of the way. So the newer locks go at a slower pace. Now, the newer locks are important because they are Panamax, which means the bigger ships. So the Disney Wonder and the Disney Magic actually have, they're too big for the original locks. And so you can't go through the 2-way traffic because your ships are too big. And so you have to wait for those premium locks and for the larger locks, which, by the way, are probably, as you might guess, more expensive. So there's a lot that goes into getting in and out of the Panama Canal, and Ken talked about all of that during his lectures, which were absolutely fabulous. And then, of course, we had the various activities that are available on board a Disney cruise, which I highly recommend, whether it's Panama Canal or otherwise. One of the other cool things about being on that ship at that particular time is that is the year that the Astros were in the World Series, and spoiler alert, wound up winning their very first franchise World Series. We were in the Panama Canal watching on the TV every single night, and if I remember correctly, the night of the Panama Canal was the night they won the World Series. But I might be off, but still, we were there for that, and it was fascinating because we played L.A., and there were people that got on in L.A. and sailed with us, so half the ship was happy and half of it wasn't. But on the day of November 4th was the day we transited the Panama Canal. And it is a full day, and you're up at about 4 a.m. if you want a good spot. But you go up on the deck, you sail into that first lock at Panama City if you're going Pacific to Atlantic. And we went through the 3 locks, and it really is a fascinating experience. And we did the new locks because of the bigger ship. But you go in, you sail in, the doors close, and then you feel the ship rising as they flood that chamber. And then they open the forward door, and you sail into that second compartment, and so on. So you go through 3 locks, and then you wind up in the lake. And the lake is maybe 2 hours to navigate from one end to the other, but you might go slower because you don't want to arrive too early or too late. We ran into a rainstorm, and so we got slowed down for a while, but we wound up sailing out about 4 or 5 in the afternoon. And it really is, again, an incredible experience to get to see this incredible man-made wonder. But when you see the original locks, you think back and you go 100 years ago, they didn't have the technology that we have now. This was built on the backs of many, many men who worked very hard to dig out those areas, dynamite out they really had to cut through the mountains, basically. And it's fascinating to see that up close and see the scale of what they had to do to build this canal. Now, when we came out of the canal, the next day, we stopped in Cartagena, Colombia. So I got to set foot on South America for the first time and add another continent to my list. So I'm only missing a couple now. I'm missing Antarctica and Australia. So other than those, I'm done. I've been to 5. But that was fascinating to get to go to Cartagena, go to the old city and walk around. Then the next day was another day at sea. And that was when Ken came back and talked about some history of the canal that we might not have known, including the secret Japanese plot to destroy the canal during World War II. Now, it might not come as a surprise to you that the Japanese wanted to destroy the waterway during World War II, and it might not come as a surprise that it's probably a big target for terrorism, and so they have to really guard it at all times, because it would certainly be something, if you're from that point of view, worth destroying and disrupting. What was interesting to me was I had no idea that the Japanese had submarines that could launch aircraft. And yes, you heard that right, submarines that had aircraft on board. And what they wound up doing was storing one single aircraft in the conning tower, and you weren't landing again. It was one of those kamikaze missions. But the idea was they were going to bring a bunch of submarines over, launch those planes, and destroy the locks. So it was very interesting to see some photos that had never been seen before, because they had just recently been declassified, and to hear the story of what the plan was had the war continued to disrupt shipping and destroy the Panama Canal. And of course, you can only imagine, number one, the worldwide impact that would have, but also the time it would take to rebuild that infrastructure would have just been awe-inspiring, even with modern technology. But it really is a fascinating place to see, and the stories that Ken told made it even more so. And then we had a couple of more stops. We stopped in Grand Cayman for the day, Cozumel for the day, and then we had one more sea day before we got into Galveston on November the 10th. Now, not everybody can do the 14-day coast-to-coast, although if you want to see the canal in its full glory, that is what I highly recommend, is that you do either an east to west or a west to east, depending on the time of year and which way you can go. And I'm not sure that there's any more benefit to one or the other. They're both going to be fascinating cruises. However, if you only have time for, say, a 10-day or a partial transit, you will still get the feel of what it's like. And it is one of those things that when you see it in person, it really shows you what we can do as humans when we put our minds to it. And so I highly recommend that you put the Panama Canal on your list of potential cruises, because I don't think you'll be disappointed. And you might learn a lot about engineering and what it takes to keep world shipping going.
You've been listening to the Rest of the Moose podcast, hosted by Chris Grum.
Why don't you forget the moose for a moment?
Previous episodes are available online at chrisgrum.com. See you next time for the Rest of the Moose.